Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here tonight and talk about ticks in Maine. And yes, it is very good timing because I know I was out just a few days ago and I think I only walked through the brush for 30 seconds and I had 4 ticks crawling up my leg. So it's time. Um, so tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about what tick species we have, what pathogens they carry here in the state of Maine. And then I want to talk about the more interesting stuff, in my opinion, which is the tick behavior and ecology. And then I want to wrap up by talking about a community science project that we've been working on in our lab for the last couple years called the Maine Forest Tick Survey. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about what ticks we have and what pathogens they carry here in the state. We have roughly 15 ticks here in the state of Maine, the vast majority of which really have very little to no impact on human health. The most important ones in terms of human health are the black-legged tick, the dog tick, and the woodchuck tick. And the black-legged tick and dog tick are by far the most commonly encountered ticks here in the state. We do have a number of other tick species. I'm not really going to go into those tonight that don't really have a lot of impact on human health. There are some that, of course, have a pretty big impact on wildlife, such as the moose tick, which is very detrimental to our moose populations. So you can see, just for an example, here's a picture of a moose, and if you look at this area on his body, his rear end, that's just a huge mass of these ticks. But of our potential human pathogen vectors, the black-legged tick is by far the most important in terms of human health. And so just to clear things up, this is also what's commonly called a deer tick, though for sort of a long, complicated story, the correct name is a black-legged tick. So I'm going to call it that for the rest of the presentation. But just know if you call it a deer tick, we're talking about the same tick here. And so the black-legged tick is the one that transmits Lyme disease here in the state of Maine. It also transmits anaplasmosis, and it can cause babesiosis as well as Powassan virus. So Lyme, anaplasmosis, and babesiosis are the 3 most common ones. Powassan is a very serious and potentially fatal disease, though luckily it's also very rare here in the state. And so you can see this is the most impact in terms of human health of all the ticks. The American dog tick, we know it's capable of transmitting pathogens in other parts of the country. None of the dog ticks that have been tested here in Maine have shown to have any pathogens, but it is something just to keep in mind that, it's potentially that, at some point maybe they are carrying them, or maybe they're carrying them in extremely low numbers and we just haven't picked them up yet. And then finally, the woodchuck tick, which isn't encountered all that often. It is out there. Occasionally people come across it. It is also capable of transmitting Powassan virus, which is that very serious, but luckily very rare pathogen here in the state. Now, we have some tick species we are on the lookout for. The first one is the Lone Star tick, and maybe I imagine a lot of people have heard about it. It's had quite a lot of coverage in the news. And this is a tick that's expanding its range, and we're starting to see it here in Maine. So far, we have not seen enough of them to be considered them established. So the ones that are being found in Maine are probably ones right now that are being brought in by wildlife. So as birds migrate through or livestock are moved in and out, it's possible that those ticks are coming in on some animals. Though it is also possible they may become established. There's been some studies that have looked at them, and it does seem like they're able to survive, at least in far southern Maine. And this tick is such a concern because just like the black-legged tick, it's capable of transmitting a whole host of different pathogens, including the red meat allergy, which I know all the carnivores are very concerned about. So this is one we're looking for, and I'll talk a little bit about whether or not we found it in our big citizen science project that we've been working on the last couple of years. Now, another tick that is probably even maybe of more concern is the Asian longhorn tick. And this is an invasive species, so it's not native to the US. It was found in 2017 in New Jersey. That arrow should be moved back a little bit. And it seems like it's predominantly attracted to livestock compared to humans. So it's definitely more of a concern if you are around livestock or if you own livestock. But you can see, even though it's only been here a few years, it has spread across quite a large area of the US already. And this is a tick of concern because we're not really sure what pathogens it may be carrying here in the US. We're not sure what pathogens it could have potentially brought with it. We're also not sure what pathogens that are already here that it may be capable of picking up and then transmitting to other hosts. And perhaps one of the most alarming things about this tick is that it does not need males to reproduce. A single female can reproduce all on her own. So if you think about it, if you have a single tick that gets introduced to a new area, that tick is potentially able to establish an entire population in that region. And some bad news, some studies have looked at the potential range of the Asian longhorn tick in North America. And so it does look like parts of Maine and parts of New England would be considered suitable habitat for it. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen, but just looking at some different models, looks like potentially they could become established here. I want to spend the majority of the time talking about the black-legged tick, just because this is the one that's of highest concern to human health. And this is the one that transmits so many of those pathogens. So it's sort of interesting, but this tick really wasn't found in the state of Maine until the 1980s. So it is a relative newcomer because it has been expanding its range northward and inland. And so here's a map of the current distribution of the black-legged tick in red and green. So you can see it's pretty widespread across the New England and the Midwest and down into the Southeast. So the counties in red are the counties that we know the tick is established. So that is technically all of Maine. And then the areas in blue are the areas where it's been reported. And then if you look at the West Coast, they have those areas in green and yellow. That's a different tick. It's Ixodes pacificus. It's related to the black-legged tick, Ixodes scapularis, but it is a different species, and this is the tick that transmits Lyme disease out west. Now, I want to go through the life cycle because we're going to be talking a lot about that throughout the rest of the presentation. So we'll start here in the spring. So these adults will lay their eggs, then the eggs will hatch into the larvae stage. And it's important to note that the larvae aren't born with pathogens. So there's not that vertical transmission. The mothers are not passing on any of the pathogens to their offspring. And so when the larvae first emerge, they're going to seek out a host to feed on and get their first blood meal. And this is the first opportunity they're going to have to pick up those pathogens. And they typically like to feed on smaller hosts like small rodents or birds that spend a lot of time on the forest floor, but they tend to be smaller animals. And after that larvae has its first blood meal, it's going to fall off and hang out in the leaf litter over the fall and winter, and then wait until the following year, and then it's going to emerge as in this nymphal stage. And this nymph is going to be looking for its second host, so it can have its second blood meal. And this is the life stage that's considered the most risky to human health. And why is that? Well, first of all, it already had one blood meal when it was in its larval stage, so it could have potentially picked up a pathogen when it had that first blood meal. And so once it has that pathogen, it has it for life. And so the nymphs are also incredibly tiny, and so they tend to go more unnoticed than, say, an adult would. And so that way they're able to feed for longer before someone notices, and so it's more likely to transmit that pathogen. So after this nymph gets its second blood meal, it's going to drop off hang out in the leaf litter again the rest of the summer, and then it's going to molt into its final stage, the adults. And then that adult is going to need one last blood meal. And typically the adults are going to be feeding on larger animals, things like deer or humans. That's often when we encounter them as well. The adults are also out in the spring, and we'll get into that a bit in a moment. But basically, these adults, again, are going to drop off into the leaf litter, hang out over winter, emerge the following spring, and lay their eggs and start the cycle over. So again, this is a 2-year life cycle for this tick. Now, that was a very generalized sort of overall life history. Let's look a little bit more Maine specific. So here we have a graph that is sort of modified from the UMaine Extension tick report. So they track tick activity, and they're tracking the number of tick submissions they get over the course of a season. And so this is sort of a typical year that we would see here in Maine. So what we have here, this is your typical tick season, late March to December. And here we have the number of ticks, and we have 3 different types of ticks here. We have the black-legged tick adults in this navy color, we have the black-legged tick nymphs in the light blue, and then we have dog ticks in purple. So where are we? So we're right here in sort of mid-April, and so we're starting to see that increase in black-legged tick adults. I know that's what I've been seeing out recently. As we go into the spring, we start to also see the dog ticks. And so spring, in a lot of people's mind, spring and early summer is what a lot of people consider to be like the high tick activity period. And it's true because we have both the black-legged ticks and the dog ticks out at the same time, usually in pretty large numbers. As the summer goes by, though, we start seeing a drop off in the number of black-legged tick adults, and the dog ticks also start to drop off. However, this is actually the time that you're at some of the higher risks for picking up pathogens right here in sort of June and July, because this is when we start to see the peak of the black-legged tick nymphs. And so again, remember, these are the ones that are really tiny and they tend to go unnoticed. And also, you're not seeing as many ticks. And so a lot of people kind of let their guard down at this period of time. But this is a time to be especially vigilant. Then as the summer goes by, we start to see a drop off in the black-legged tick nymphs. There's virtually no dog ticks out in the late summer. And then we typically see some kind of peak of the black-legged tick adults, and they'll be out trying to get that final blood meal. So if you're a deer hunter, you're probably very familiar with that, because I'm sure you encounter a lot of ticks there in the fall. So it's really important to be able to identify the ticks, especially the difference between dog ticks and black-legged ticks. So dog ticks, they have white markings on their bodies, and the males and females look pretty different, but they both have white. So here we have 2 adult dog ticks up here on the left, and you can see the female and the male, they both have white on them. One has a white confined more to the shield, whereas the other one has white kind of all throughout the back of its body. But the black-legged tick adults, they don't have any of that white streaking or any of those white marks. They're typically sort of a brown to reddish color, depending on the life stage and male or female, but they all have this sort of dark body with a darker shield right here. And then if we look at the adult versus nymphs, so here the picture on the far left, this is the adult black-legged tick, and then also a nymph black-legged tick. So they look very similar, just a smaller scale. And then for whatever weird reason, we almost never encounter the dog tick nymphs. I don't know why. Maybe someone else knows, I don't know. The dog tick adults we encounter very frequently. The nymphs we don't. But if you ever do see this thing, it looks very different. This is a dog tick nymph, and it looks very different than the adults. It doesn't have any of that white on its body, but still, so here we have black-legged tick on the right, and you can see they're pretty different. And what you can look for if you ever do see these are these 2 red dots here on their back, and that lets you know that's the dog tick nymph. Though again, they're rarely encountered, but I just want to put that up there because it's so interesting. And so if you do see it, it'll look very different from everything else you've probably seen. And it's also just really important to keep in mind that black-legged tick nymphs are incredibly tiny. They're about the size of a poppy seed. And so the CDC put this figure out a number of years ago, and no tick presentation is complete without it. And so they put 5 black-legged tick nymphs on this poppy seed muffin just to show you the scale of these ticks. So in case you can't see them, they're right here in the middle of this picture on the right. 5 little black-legged tick nymphs, and they truly are the size of a poppy seed. Now, I think most people are aware that Lyme disease is definitely a growing problem in the US, and that's particularly true in Maine. So if we look at this map on the left, here are the number of reported Lyme disease cases in 2001. And you can see Maine has very few cases, virtually no cases of Lyme disease, just a few scatterings across the state. And then if we fast forward to 2019 and we focus in on Maine again, we can see that there's a significant number of Lyme disease cases here in the state. So all these blue dots represent a single Lyme disease case. And I just want to point out, Massachusetts does not have some sort of miracle strategy they've employed to eradicate their Lyme disease cases. The way they have so many cases that the way they report them now, the CDC isn't able to include them in their data set. But if they did, that would probably just be solid blue. So unfortunately, they don't have any secrets that they can share with us. And so Lyme disease is caused by a bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi, and it's the bacteria that the tick passes and makes us sick. It's the most widespread vector-borne disease in the US, and there's probably 300,000 to 400,000 cases in the US every year. The majority of those are right here in New England. And if we look at Lyme disease in a little more detail here in Maine, this map on the left shows the rate of Lyme disease by town per 100,000 people. And you can see that the majority of cases are still southern and coastal Maine, so they're definitely starting to push further inland, and also we do see them even in northern Maine. Not as often, but there's probably a pretty good chance that the black-legged tick is going to continue to expand its range, and that we will start to see more cases in other parts of Maine as well. In 2021, if you looked at all the black-legged ticks that were tested for pathogens, roughly half of them were positive for at least one pathogen. That's a lot. I'm not saying you have to 50% chance of getting the pathogen if one bites you, but if one does bite you, there's a 50-50 chance that tick may be carrying a pathogen. And of those ticks, about 42% of them tested positive for that Lyme bacteria. And then the rest of them were either carrying anaplasma or babesia. If we look at tick-borne diseases in Maine over time, so here we have a graph, and it shows the 3 most common tick-borne pathogens, Lyme, anaplasmosis, and babesiosis. And again, this is the rate of pathogens or rate of diseases per 100,000 people. And then here we have the year on the bottom of the graph. And so you can see this graph starts in 2001. And in 2001, we had just a few Lyme cases here in the state. If you remember that map we just looked at, not very many. And we had really no other cases here in this state. As time has gone by, we have definitely seen an increase in Lyme disease, but we're also seeing an increase in anaplasmosis and babesiosis as well. Though, of course, Lyme is the sort of most prevalent tick-borne disease here in the state. And I feel like this figure is a little misleading because it doesn't have the 2021 data yet. 2020 was an incredibly hot and dry July. I don't know if you remember. It was just sort of a strange year all around, honestly. And so there were a lot fewer black-legged ticks out, and so people were encountering them at lower levels. And so that's probably why we're seeing this decrease in these tick-borne diseases for that year. I can pretty much bet money that once the 2021 data has been added in, we're going to see it go right back up. And 2021 was actually a pretty busy tick year, so I'm guessing we might even break some records. We'll see, but I just didn't want you to look at this and think, oh, well, I think we're going in the right direction now, because I think it's more just it was sort of a funny year. Okay, let's get into the interesting stuff now. Let's talk about some different tick behavior and some different studies that have looked at these things. So first of all, let's talk about host finding behavior. How do ticks find their hosts? The black-legged tick is a very passive host finder. It does something called questing, where what it does, it climbs up to the top of vegetation, blades of grass, even leaf litter, and it just sits there with its legs outstretched, and it waits for a host to come by. As that host comes by, as it brushes by the tick latches on, and then it'll seek out a place on the body of the host to start feeding. So these things aren't jumping, they're not falling out of trees onto you, they're not, ambushing you, they're not chasing their host down. And in their whole life, they're really moving probably less than a meter. They're not going very far. And then you're maybe wondering, like, so how are they coming into different regions? And it's the wildlife that moves them. They're not really crawling very great distances. The dog tick is a little more active than the black-legged tick. It will also quest very commonly. That's how we pick them up. It can also walk towards its host as well. It does have some sensory organs that it uses, so it can detect some CO2. And these red dots we were talking about earlier, this is the dog tick nymph. These are actually where their eyes are. So it has some primitive eyes on its backs. So there's two red dots. It's weird. It's, not on their heads. They're on their backs, which I guess makes sense if you're a tick. And so they'll also quest, or again, they can walk towards their host. Now, the Lone Star tick is an interesting tick because it will quest, but it will also hunt its host, and it's considered an active hunter. And what it can do, it will follow a carbon dioxide trail. So as its host is breathing out, it can follow that trail, kind of like a mosquito does, and it can cover quite a large distance as it's seeking out that host, which is kind of horrifying, really, if you think about it. So let's look a little bit more at questing. So here's a video that's showing what it looks like when a tick is out questing. So like I said, it climbs up to the top of a blade of grass or some vegetation, and then it'll just sit there with its legs outstretched. So it's kind of, just sort of figuring out where it wants to be, and it kind of moves around periodically. But most of the time, it's not doing a whole lot. It's just sort of sitting there like that. And depending on the life stage of the tick will sort of influence where it likes to quest or how high. So the younger life stages, like the larvae and nymphs, they tend to quest at the top of fallen leaves, whereas the adults will quest up a little higher onto higher vegetation, usually maybe around knee height or so. Now, this is probably one of the most interesting studies looking at questing behavior in ticks. And so if we look at the distribution of ticks, this is this top map you see here with the red and blue, and you can see all those shaded counties or areas that have black-legged ticks. And if we look at the map on the bottom, this is the number of reported Lyme disease cases. And you can see that there's definitely not an overlap there. So why is it that even though the southern counties, particularly let's say Florida, still has these black-legged ticks, but they have very few Lyme disease cases? That's a great question, and it's a very interesting answer. So the study wondered that exact same thing. And so they went out and collected ticks from different parts of the country, and they measured their questing behavior. So they had ticks from Wisconsin and then in South Carolina. So you can see South Carolina certainly has those black-legged ticks, but doesn't have nearly as many of the Lyme disease cases. And what they found was the ticks that live up north, in this case Wisconsin, they actually quest, they'll quest, whereas the ticks down south, they tend to spend more time in the leaf litter. And so they're almost even less active than the ones up north. And this is probably because they're so sensitive to temperature and humidity, and they're likely to easily dry out, that they really can't leave that leaf litter on the forest floor and quest and put themselves up a little higher where they may encounter us. And so we just aren't encountering them as often. As people, we're just not, we're not crawling and rolling around in the leaf litter. That would be ridiculous. I mean, maybe you are, I don't know, that would be weird though. So these ticks just aren't, we're just not encountering them. So it's really interesting, and that's one of the reasons why it's such a problem here in New England, in the Midwest, because they are in areas that humans encounter them, as opposed to some of these areas down south. And then if we look at feeding, this is one of my favorite pictures of a tick. This shows just their mouth parts magnified, and you can see it has all these little backwards facing barbs. So if you've ever tried to pull a tick out, how many times have you left the head in your body? Like you pull it off and the body comes off and the head stays there. It's partly because it has these backwards facing barbs, and so it really is hard to pull it off. And it also will secrete some substances to numb the area, so you hopefully don't feel it, and it's able to get its full blood meal. And this is when it's transmitting its pathogens. And so as it's taking that blood meal, it's regurgitating some of those fluids that it has in its body that has those pathogens, and that's how we get sick. And this is another really interesting study that was looking at their feeding location behavior of ticks. And so this was a study done in Europe, so slightly different species of ticks, but another Ixodes species, which is related to our black-legged ticks. So they found that when they look at birds, the vast majority of ticks are on their heads. And so they wanted to know, is this a behavioral preference? Are the ticks seeking out this site to feed on, or is it just that the ticks are randomly finding a site on the body, and wherever that tick is, if it's not on the head, it's more likely to be groomed off? So what they did is they took a number of different species of birds, and they put roughly 1,000 ticks on their heads, their backs, and their bellies. And then they left them, these birds, and the birds are allowed to groom any ticks off or just do whatever they would do. And they went back to count how many ticks were on those different parts of the body. And they saw that if we look at the back, they only found a couple ticks. Their bellies, they only found a few ticks as well. But on the head, they started out with 1,302 ticks, a really random number. But they had over 2,000 ticks on the head at the end of the study. So it really shows that these ticks are preferentially selecting sites that are advantageous for them. They definitely have a preference for where they're feeding on their hosts. And so it's just really interesting. It's not just about the animals being able to groom them off. It's also about there is definitely this behavioral preference in ticks as well. And then if we look at reproduction, we might not watch this whole video, but I think that's kind of cool. So again, this is another Ixodes species. This is related to our Ixodes scapularis we have here, but a different species. This is what they have in Europe. And you can see this is a male and a female mating. And a lot of times this mating takes place on their host. So I don't know if anyone here hunts deer, but if you were to examine the deer afterwards and you start seeing those ticks, and if you pull them off, a lot of times you'll see a big engorged female with this little male attached to her. So they take that final blood meal that they get from their host, and all that energy gets converted into creating these eggs. And that's one of the reasons that the female gets so large compared to the male. Like, 'cause the male doesn't need that much blood. They take sort of very small, infrequent blood meals. And so they don't need nearly as much as the females. So the females start laying the eggs, and it's sort of a long process. And this is interesting because she can actually sense sort of the environment around her, and she can kind of move the eggs to be a little advantageous. So like right here, she was moving the eggs away from the hot camera. I mean, she's not going to travel a really far distance and seek out the best possible site, but she probably does have some ability within the area that she drops off in to try to pick an area that's most advantageous for her eggs. And as she's laying these eggs, a few every day, she really starts to just deflate like a balloon. And we really start to see egg production slows down as she goes through this process. So here we are, day 17. Here we are, day 23. You can see she's pretty well deflated at this point. And then here on day 28, she laid her very last egg. And then once she lays her final egg, she dies. She's done. So this individual tick laid about 1,700 eggs. And I know people talk about going out and looking for tick nests and destroying them. You'll never see them. I mean, you can see how just incredibly tiny they are. And then here we are, the little tiny larvae. And it's really interesting because the larvae are born with 6 legs, not 8. And they don't get 8 legs until they get to their nymphal stage. And then, of course, they have them for the adult stage as well. We spend a lot of time talking about on-host behavior, questing behavior, searching for a host. But when we think about ticks, really the vast majority of their life, 95% of their life, is spent off-host. And so if I just put this figure of the life cycle back up here, so it has those 3 blood meals over 2 years, but each blood meal is only lasting, a few days at a time. So what are they doing the rest of the time? Well, they're spending most of the time hanging out in the leaf litter. They're trying to stay in an area that has adequate temperature and humidity, but there's really high mortality. There's a number of different natural enemies out there, some different fungi that will attack them, and nematodes, as well as predatory insects that will kill them. And they're also very sensitive to temperature and humidity. So I want to get a little bit more into tick ecology. And man, it can get really complicated really fast. So when we think about tick ecology, we really have to think about the hosts they feed on, the overall climate, but not just climate, also the microclimate, because that can vary a lot. Even the same forest can have very different microclimate 1 foot away from, just another few feet further in the forest. And then plants also can have a pretty big impact on tick populations as well. We'll get into all that. So let's start by talking about some weather microclimate. Ticks are very sensitive to temperature and humidity, and by far the most sensitive to humidity. They have a pretty large surface to volume ratio, which makes them prone to drying out. Once they dry out, they die. And so humidity is really critical for their survival. So here was a study that was looking at ticks at 2 different humidity levels, 80% and 60%. And they exposed these ticks for 24 hours and they measured their mortality. So after 8 hours, we can see here the tick survival is very similar. They seem to do okay at the 2 humidity levels. However, after 16 hours, we see that the ticks at the lower humidity levels, about half of them, they have about half the survival rate as the higher humidity level. And after 24 hours, we see virtually no survival at the 60% humidity level. So really, they need this sort of around 80% humidity. And you may be thinking, well, Maine, luckily, is not 80% humid all the time because we don't live on the Gulf Coast, thankfully. But, where they're spending most of the time is very humid. So if you go into the forest, you pick up a clump of dead leaves on the forest floor, even if it hasn't rained recently, it's probably damp under there. And so that's why they're spending so much time in those sort of environments. Snowpack can also have a really big impact on the ticks. So people always ask me after it's been a really cold winter, do you think it killed the ticks? And the answer is always, well, what was the snow like? So this was an experiment done by a graduate student in the lab here at the University of Maine. She had a couple different sites. She did this overwintering study. Cape Elizabeth and Presque Isle were the 2 sites she did this study in, and those sort of represent 2 extremes of Maine. Cape Elizabeth, of course, is warmer, typically less snow. Presque Isle is colder with more snow. And she created these little habitats where basically she took a soil core, put it in a bucket, and then put the ticks in a little enclosure inside this bucket, and then buried the bucket so it was level with the ground. And then she had 4 different types of treatments that she manipulated with the ticks. So she had areas where she removed all the snow and leaves from on top of these enclosures. She had areas where she removed the snow but left the leaf litter on top of these buckets. And then she had areas where she left the snow, no leaves, and then areas that had both the snow and leaves, which kind of represents what, you know, sort of would typically be found in an area that has a lot of snow and a deep leaf litter layer. And what did she found? She found that the areas that had the snow and leaves absent, you can see here, this is here on the graph in green, this had the lowest proportion of survival. So there not very many ticks survived when there were neither leaves nor snow to give them that insulation. And you think about it, like snow especially is a very good insulator. So even if it's -30 outside, it's right around freezing underneath the snow, which ticks do very well at. And then the treatment that the ticks did the best at was here in blue at both sites. This is the areas that had snow and leaves, and those ticks had the highest survival. So it just goes to show that things like your forest composition, like your leaf litter layer, as well as your snowpack, can have a really big impact regardless of what the temperature is. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the host of the black-legged tick and how that kind of fits into the ecology. So here we have, again, this is just a representation of the different life stages: eggs, larvae, nymphs, and adults. And when it goes to each different life stage, it's going to need to take a blood meal from a host. And so when we think about the ticks, we also have to think about their hosts and what impacts their hosts, because that in turn could impact the ticks. So for example, if we have a really high acorn year, that may increase the rodent population, which could then potentially increase the tick population. And then the inverse is true if we have a large predator population. If we have an area that has a large fox or coyote population, we may have a decrease in some of those hosts of the black-legged ticks, like the rodents, and it could potentially decrease those tick populations. We have about 125 different hosts in North America that the black-legged ticks will feed on. Some are certainly better for survival than others. Some hosts are much more likely to transmit pathogens to the ticks, whereas others don't carry the pathogens. So if a tick feeds on them, they're not going to pick up their pathogen. So there's just a lot of variety when we're thinking about all the different hosts. So a host reservoir, this is an animal that carries and can transmit that tick-borne pathogen to a tick. So if a tick feeds on, let's say, a mouse, and the mouse has that Lyme bacteria in its body, that can be passed on to the tick, and now that tick is infected and could potentially pass it on when it takes its next blood meal. So our most important reservoirs here in the state of Maine are the white-footed mouse, chipmunks, and shrews. Those are considered the sort of most important vectors of the Lyme bacteria. And one of the most interesting things, and what makes this mouse such a good reservoir, is that this Lyme bacteria that it carries has no impact on the mouse survival. So it's so interesting, because if we get that bacteria, we can become very ill, we can run fevers, we can be achy, we can feel awful. The mouse is just fine. So it's a very efficient vector because it doesn't get sick. Now, I think a lot of people, when they think about black-legged ticks, they think about deer, and it makes sense. I mean, a lot of people call them deer ticks. And deer are definitely an important part of the black-legged tick life cycle, because a single deer can provide a blood meal for a large number of ticks. So here, this top picture, you can see her ears are just covered in ticks. I mean, this is probably a more of extreme case, but a deer can carry a large tick burden on their bodies. And they're especially important to the adult black-legged ticks. This is what they predominantly feed on when they are adults, and this is also where the males and females typically encounter one another for mating purposes. However, it is important to note that deer do not transmit Borrelia burgdorferi, the Lyme disease pathogen. However, we do have a lot of deer in the country. And so it may seem, obvious answer would be, well, let's reduce the deer populations and we'll reduce the tick populations. But the relationship is not always super clear. There have been studies that have shown if you reduce the deer population, it does reduce the tick population. Other studies have not shown that. And there's been a large number of studies that looked at things like a deer exclusion fence, trying to keep deer out. Because what happens when a tick is feeding on a deer, let's say, whenever it's done feeding, it's just going to drop off. And wherever it drops off, that's where it's going to lay its eggs. It's not going to crawl off and then travel a long distance seeking out the perfect environment. So if a deer is walking through, let's say, an open grassy area, and a tick drops off there, there's probably a good chance that tick will not survive and any eggs it lays are probably going to die. Whereas if a tick is walking through your wooded backyard and it drops off a tick, that's probably a much better habitat for that tick and it will survive. Also been some research looking at what's called a four-poster station. And this basically works by feeding deer. So the deer come in, they put their head into the feed bucket. And as they stick their head into the feed bucket, it has these rollers and they can deposit some insecticides and kill the ticks on the deer's body. And I want to talk a little bit about this whole possum controversy. So if you're on social media at all, you've probably been hearing about ticks and possums, and for about 10 years, people were talking about how great the possums were for the ticks, and now people are saying, no, they're really awful. So let's just talk about the studies behind this, and because there's like a lot of misinformation out there. So 2009, there was a study that looked at sort of the grooming behavior of different animals that had ticks on them. And so what they found were, when they looked at different species, they looked at, mice and some birds and chipmunks, squirrels, and possums, that the possums, when they held them in the lab, they groomed the vast majority of the ticks off their bodies, which was great and really interesting. And so people thought it was wonderful. And so for some reason, people seem to think the possums are going around eating ticks in the environment, and that's certainly not the case. But when they were in the lab and they're held in the lab, they did seem to groom a large number of ticks off their bodies. And then a very recent study looked at, okay, well, what's actually in wild possum stomachs? And so they did a lot of dissections looking at stomach contents to see, do they have ticks in their stomachs? Are they really grooming a large number of ticks off their bodies when they're in the wild and when they're not in the lab? And so this wasn't a huge study. I can't remember the exact number of stomach contents they looked at, but of all the stomach contents they looked at, they didn't see any ticks in there. And so it kind of makes you think, well, even though they're grooming a lot of ticks off themselves in the lab, that might not be what's realistically happening in the wild. There were a lot of other insects in their stomachs, though they did not see any ticks. So that's the possum controversy, and now you know. So when you see some crazy stuff posted on social media, you can correct people. There's also definitely a connection between black-legged tick ecology and plants. We know that invasive plants are linked to increases in ticks and their pathogens. And why is that? Well, that's because invasive plants, their very nature is to grow out of control. And so when you grow out of control, like this picture here we see, this is an understudy totally covered in Japanese barberry. It creates this really dense understory, which is great for ticks because it has a really high humidity level under there. And then their hosts are also very protected. So imagine you're a little mouse living in the world, you probably have a much better chance of surviving and reproducing in this kind of environment because you're so hidden from your predators as opposed to like a more of an open natural forest. Just briefly, I know people have asked me about ticks and fire, and it's sort of interesting. We did have a master's student that looked at sort of black-legged tick distribution on MDI, and she found that the areas that had the fire in 1947, which if you're not familiar, this is the map of MDI. This area in black is the area that burned at the 1947 fire. And this really changed the landscape of the island in this area. There were a lot more hardwood trees in this area after the fire. And even now today, it's kind of incredible, all these years later, there's more ticks in this area that was burned compared to other regions of the island. So it really goes to show that sort of land changes can have big impacts even many years down the road. Other studies that have looked at fires to control ticks have had sort of mixed results. There's generally an initial reduction in ticks, though it tends to be very short-lived, and some studies even saw an increase in ticks after sort of minor fires. Now, I want to end by talking about the Maine Forest Tick Survey. And this was a community science project we've been working on for the last couple of years. And the goals of this project were to try to understand the relationships between forest management and ticks and tick-borne diseases. So we know that landowners manage their land in a really wide variety of ways, everything from sort of large-scale commercial timber harvest to managing invasive plants or feeding wildlife to doing absolutely nothing at all. So we wanted to see how all these different management activities impacted the tick population. And then ultimately, we wanted to use this information to develop recommendations on how landowners can reduce their own tick-borne disease risks. So if we look at the state of Maine, so here again is that same map of Lyme disease cases here in the state. And you can see that the vast majority of our Lyme disease cases are sort of southern and coastal Maine counties. And it's interesting because this lines up very well with the counties that have the highest percentage of non-industrial private forest land ownership. So here, these counties in darker blue, these are the ones that are typically owned by private individuals or families as opposed to these larger timber corporations. And so this is why we chose these counties to work on in our experiment in this study. We have both high Lyme disease cases and also a lot of properties that are owned by individuals, which means we're probably going to see a lot more variety in management styles and management activities. So our volunteers collected data two different ways. They filled out surveys online that answered questions about their forest vegetation and their forest management history. And then they also collected ticks on their properties using drag cloths. And I'll explain what that is. So tick dragging is a scientific way to collect ticks. It's how we collect ticks for our lab's research. And so we trained our volunteers to collect ticks the exact same way. So this works because as you're dragging this cloth over low growing vegetation and leaf litter, the ticks that are out questing thinks it's a host and they grab a hold, and the volunteer stops periodically to pull any ticks off of those cloths. So let's look at our results. We had, over the 2 years, nearly 600 applications. I wish we could have taken everyone, but it's just, expenses made it impossible. But we did sample, or I should say the volunteers sampled 266 properties, and we had on average an 85% completion rate, which is really incredible for a community science project. Now, even though we had, 170 properties sampled, we only got 3 tick species that were collected: dog ticks, black-legged ticks, and rabbit ticks, though the vast majority of ticks that people collected were the dog and the black-legged ticks. And if we look at the 2 years, you can see in year 1, we collected a significant number of ticks, though we collected a lot more ticks the following year. We collected over 5,000 ticks the second year, which was just incredible. So every single tick was identified to species, and all of the black-legged tick nymphs were sent off to be tested for pathogens. And then all our volunteers then get that information back at the end of our processing. And if you participated in this year, your reports are coming out in just a couple weeks. Our volunteers also, very interesting, collected 885 non-tick specimens, thinking they were ticks. And I'll get a little bit more into that in a minute as well. So if we look at the pathogens, even though the number of ticks varied quite significantly from year to year, the pathogen or the prevalence of pathogens really didn't change from year to year. So each year we had about 25% of the black-legged tick nymphs tested positive for the Lyme bacteria, about 6% tested positive for anaplasma, and another 6% tested positive for babesia. Now here, this is, I think, truly the interesting part. So if you've been taking a nap, wake up. So if we look at the impact of timber harvesting on the black-legged tick population, we can see that timber harvest reduced ticks over a large time scale. So this is really interesting. So we asked everyone, when was your last timber harvest? And then they collected ticks in those areas. So here we have, this is the last year since the last timber harvest and the number of black-legged ticks they collected on average. And you can see that the areas that had a timber harvest, particularly in the last 20 years, had significantly fewer ticks compared to areas that have not had a timber harvest in over 20 years or have never had a timber harvest at all in their known history. We also saw a really big impact of invasive plants, which is not super surprising, but we saw the areas that had invasive plants present had significantly more black-legged ticks than those areas that had no invasive plants. This was especially true for barberry and honeysuckle, so it's just one more good reason to try to manage the invasive plants on your properties. So here we have all those non-tick arthropods that people collected, thinking they were ticks. So we had about 885 non-tick specimens. The vast majority of those were mites, which makes sense. Those, they're small, kind of the same size of a tick. They both have 8 legs. Also commonly collected were small spiders, as well as a number of hemipterans. Most of these were immature hemipterans, a lot of immature stink bugs. And then we also collected a number, or the volunteers collected a number of beetles. Most of those were Cuculionidae, the weevils, which it's interesting. You wouldn't think they look like a tick. When they're dead, they really don't. But I had some weevils walking on my drag cloth last summer, and I was like, yeah, I can definitely see how those are mistaken. Something about the way they move kind of does look like a tick. So just to summarize, we had really good participation rate, which was just incredible. There were significantly fewer black-legged ticks in areas that had a timber harvest in the past 20 years. There were significantly more ticks in areas with invasive plants, and mites and spiders are most commonly collected non-tick specimens that are mistaken for ticks. So with that, I just want to give you a couple resources that you can, if you're interested in learning more about ticks. The Maine Department of Health and Human Services has a great website that has a lot of vector-borne information, different diseases. You can also look at trends over time. The Maine Cooperative Extension has an incredible website and services available for the people who live here in the state of Maine. You can send any tick that you find and they'll identify it for you for free. And if you want to have them test it for pathogens, it's a $15 fee, which is really incredible and so much cheaper than pretty much any other options out there. They also have really great maps and real-time data that shows what ticks are active and what pathogens, so you can look at your individual town and see what people have submitted and how many pathogens they're carrying. And if you want a super in-depth look at more about the ecology of Lyme disease, this is a really great book. It's called Lyme Disease, The Ecology of a Complex System. So with that, I just want to thank you so much for spending your evening learning about ticks with me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
All right, thanks so much, Elissa. That was certainly some wonderful and creepy information there. I'm having some PTSD of working in areas in New York with Lone Star tick larval hatches we were walking through, and anyways,
yes.
Yeah, but good to see some of those pictures and yeah, get reminded of what's going on out there. So yeah, a few questions. One question asked, Charlene asked, how many ticks were tested for disease? I was looking at the reports at the time, so I answered that in the chat for folks. So yeah, over 3,000 in 2021, almost 2,500 in 2020, and almost 2,000 in 2019. So very nice sample size, I'd say.
Yeah, so the first year we tested, so this is black-legged ticks, adults and nymphs, but the vast majority of the ticks that were collected were the nymphs, and so probably 600 some odd in the first year and around 2,000 in the second year that we tested for pathogens.
Gotcha. Okay. Question from Kathy. Isn't one reason for low Lyme numbers in 2001 because many medical folks didn't know about it, didn't recognize the symptoms, didn't have means to test for it, etc.? I've certainly met folks who suffered from Lyme disease for years that were misdiagnosed early on.
Yeah, no, definitely that is part of it. And in overall, Lyme disease is a very underreported and probably underdiagnosed disease. So right now there's about 30,000 cases that are reported in the US, but even now, even today, that they think that's a tenfold underestimation. So although 30,000 cases are reported annually, it's probably closer to 300,000 actual cases. So that was definitely a problem in 2001. It's still a problem now, but yeah, that may have been part of the reason it's lower, but it is definitely a trend that we are seeing increase over time. That's a great question.
Yep. Next question about collection. Michael asks, are traditional collecting methods, mostly flagging, adequate for collecting Lone Star and Asian longhorn ticks?
That's a great question. So you can actually set these passive traps that sit in the field. So I don't know if you're familiar with collecting mosquitoes. You have like a container that has CO2 and then they go in and they get trapped. There are some studies that have shown that those sort of traps work for Lone Star, so you can use a CO2 trap. I'm not sure if they're commercially available or you make your own. I couldn't say. You can still collect them probably with questing as well, because I know some other experiments have done the drag sampling and they do pick up the Lone Star tick. Asian longhorn tick, I'm really honestly not sure the best way to collect them. They tend to be found on domesticated livestock. So I don't know if, I want to say most of them have been collected off of livestock, but I'm not sure the best way to sample an area to see if they're there. It's a great question. I don't know.
And we actually have a supplementary answer there from Deborah in the chat box about that.
Oh,
So
yeah.
she says she's writing from Missouri. She says so. Regarding Lone Star ticks, they can be collected via flagging nymphs and adults by carbon dioxide traps, like you said. And she does say that Asian longhorn ticks can be flagged successfully. So
Oh, cool. Okay.
there you have
Interesting.
it.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. And then, yeah, last question in the chat box right now. And yeah, folks, if you have questions, get them in there. But Kathy asked to please explain why / how deer don't actually transmit the pathogen. I assume referring to Lyme disease there.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's really interesting. They don't tend to really carry it. We do occasionally see the deer with some, but it's not like the white-footed mouse where they so predominantly carry it. And I don't know like the exact sort of
It might be a
biophysical
question for
details
the
as to,
deer biologist.
yes. If there's a deer biologist in the room, please speak up.
Yeah. Yeah. But great. So yeah, if anybody has any last minute questions, get them in the chat box, or if anybody does want to open up their mic and ask a question rather than type it, go right ahead. Oops, here's another question. Do we think nymphs are primary vectors?
So I'm not quite sure what you mean. So nymphs and adults are both capable of transmitting pathogens. The reason why there's such an emphasis on nymphs is just that they're small, and so they tend to go unnoticed. So the longer a tick is feeding, the more likely it is to pass on that pathogen. So if you have an adult on you, you're more likely to find it and remove it before it transmits those pathogens, where because the nymphs are so much smaller, they tend to go unnoticed. And so those tend to be the ones that are more likely to feed longer and then thus transmit the pathogens. But if you look at the black-legged tick adults, they tend to have a higher percentage of those are carrying pathogens because they've had at that point 2 blood meals as opposed to the nymphs that have only had 1 blood meal. But it's just a matter of how long they feed on us and how quickly we can realize they're there.
Right. So another question here, does Cooperative Extension want us to send in any and all ticks we find for their research, or only those that have fed on us?
Oh, any ticks, yeah. They even ask like where you found it. So you can, if it's on yourself or a pet, or if you just saw it, happened to be outside and saw it, yeah, definitely they have a whole form that you can fill out that gives them a lot of really great data as to where you found the tick, who you found it on. So yeah, feel free to send any of those in.
Great. So, all righty, that looks like it's it for the questions. I'll see if any come in while I'm wrapping up here, but it is 8 o'clock, so that takes us to the end of our hour. So yeah, thanks again so much, Elissa. A really timely reminder, and yeah, I hope folks will be extra safe out there, you know, while you're working in the yard or, you know, out collecting insects, because yeah, this is a trending problem, I guess, as we're seeing, like most other things, where things are only going to get worse from here on out. But yeah, so hopefully folks were able to tune into a lot of the webinars. This is our last one for this current season, so we'll take a break for the summer months, and then yeah, keep an eye out for announcements, and we'll reconvene when the weather gets crappy again in you know, late fall, early winter. So yeah, that's all I have. So thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Elissa, and yeah, everybody take care and be safe.
Thank you.
Bye bye.